Thanks, Isabel, and thanks everybody for joining us for this first kind of main session of our annual scientific meeting of MEOPAR. We just had a session just a short time ago about where we outlined really the vision for where MEOPAR is going in the future, and that was co-presented by myself as long-standing, I would say, 10 years, my goodness, scientific director of MEOPAR, together with MEOPAR's new members of the scientific leadership, Brent Else from the University of Calgary and Fanny Noisette from the Université Québec à Rimouski. And that was showing the way where MEOPAR is hoping to go in the future, and certainly addressing the challenges of changing climate and the adaptation and the resilience required across Canada, especially Canada's coastal and oceanic regions, is something that's very dear to our heart and very relevant to what we've been doing together with partners in government and other organizations over the past decade, and what we hope to continue to work on in the future. And so that's why this session's particularly kind of up front and center in our annual scientific meeting, because it's going to be discussing Climate Science 2050 Plan and with presentations from Environment and Climate Change Canada and Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And it was intended originally that Karen Dodds, our board chair of MEOPAR, was going to host the session. Karen just hasn't, well, at short notice, had to couldn't attend, and so you've got me again, unfortunately. Karen, however, has been guiding us very much because she is a former ADM, Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, and really understands how federal science works, and has been a great help for us in MEOPAR in understanding how to be relevant and to partner effectively, as, however, have our two speakers today. So Climate Science 2050 Plan, I'm not going to say much about what it is, because I think Marjorie is going to tell us mainly about that one, about our first speaker, but it really is a pretty ambitious plan put forward in the context of Canada's approach to being climate resilient and a net zero Canada by 2050. It involves a lot of synthesis and thinking about science and knowledge mobilization, not only in the natural sciences, but in the social and health sciences, including and the behavioral sciences. My impression of reading it, and thinking about it, is that it's urgent, visionary, and really challenging. So it's with great pleasure, actually, that we can introduce the two speakers who will present on this today. First of all, Marjorie Shepherd, who's the Director and Senior Climate Change Science Advisor of the Science and Technology Strategies Directorate of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then also Keith Lennon, who's the Director of Fisheries and Oceans Canada's Ocean Sciences branch. And with these two perspectives, I think we'll get a really good feel for what the Climate Science 2050 Plan entails. So without any further ado, Marjorie, if it's okay, if I can just hand over to you to start this session off. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Doug, and to Isabel as well for inviting me to have this opportunity. We're just in sort of the final proofreading stages of the science plan and finalizing some of the figures, etc. So a lot of what people may have seen up to this point, and even the figures in this presentation, are still all subject to that final layout and seeking of typos, etc., etc. But I think this is a lovely opportunity for us to also get feedback on how relevant, how clear, how useful this kind of an exercise is. So moving into it, I'll just talk to the title for a moment. Climate Science 2050 is sort of our umbrella title or branding, which really anchors this in developing the science that'll help us get to those climate objectives, climate goals, climate targets that are set out there for 2050. It's not that we're going to deliver the science in 2050. We have to start doing that and keep doing that continually. So the next slide, please. we started this exercise in 2018, and the intent then was to develop a prioritized list of science activities so the federal government would know what to fund. It turned out, though, that this was the first time anyone had tried to convene the national climate change science community to talk about what are the information needs of those out there developing climate programs, policies, regulations, what have you. So despite the best intentions to develop a set of priorities, we ended up with a stock take, or a synthesis of the broad needs, information needs across all aspects of science. But we did lay down a marker that it must be inclusive of all the natural, social, and health sciences to address these really complex challenges and the desire for transformative social change. So we set up a structure we thought would work. It had basic themes, really quite traditional: Earth system climate science, healthy people, resilient environments, carbon neutral or net zero society, developing resiliency in ecosystems, and sustainable natural resources. We intentionally framed them all as the societal outcome we wanted to get to. Within this, there was a set of guiding principles. We made space for Indigenous-led science and knowledge, as well as a real emphasis that knowledge mobilization must proceed as equally important to new research. And then, of course, we were concerned that everyone would be so happy to fund new science, they would forget to fund that basic infrastructure that we rely on around monitoring and observational capacity, digital infrastructure, and of course, enabling open science and transparency in what we do. So that was the structure we ended up with, and that report is available, published almost 2 years ago now. So the next slide are the principles that we developed for moving, no, one back. Thank you. For moving forward with the science planning and the knowledge mobilization. We wanted to ensure that we were building on what we already have, existing knowledge, that we're creating the right mechanisms and opportunities for interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary science, and that we are being inclusive of all those voices in the science community. So roughly speaking, we divided it up into principles around equity, collaboration, and responsiveness. And I think it's particularly this last piece on responsiveness that has driven a lot of our work over the last little while. Science that is relevant to those undertaking climate action. So the next slide, please. As I said, this started in 2018 because we recognized that the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change did not have a science component. Similarly, the recent emission reductions plan for reaching 2030 targets did not have a substantive science component. And we were, though, grateful to see that the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act did identify a role for science, and that all the emission reduction plans should be based on best available science. So similarly, the National Adaptation Strategy is emerging, and it too recognizes very much the importance of developing science and knowledge data to inform that adaptation action. So really what we're doing is we're creating that third piece, that science pillar for moving forward with achieving domestic climate goals. So those are the primary drivers which have shaped this entire prioritization exercise. Next slide, please. So again, why do it? We've been doing pretty well so far in a rather ad hoc manner. We know we've got lovely examples of where science has been informing and impacting the climate agenda, whether it be resilient building codes, understanding vector-borne diseases, public health challenges, health of Canadians, and even in Canada's Changing Climate Report. But these are, to some extent, one-ofs. They've each happened independently within their own community, And we've not really looked at the kind of science that's necessary to measure progress in achieving those emission reduction goals, refine our approaches to either mitigation or adaptation, and identify those new opportunities for action. So this gave us a sense of opportunity for strategic thinking. So the whole intent of what we're doing right now is to develop a basis to guide and prioritize the national science investment funding for science. It is, as I said, really anchored in our net zero legislation and the national adaptation strategy that is coming forward. So we want to close those knowledge gaps and mobilize the knowledge that will really help design, evaluate, and refine our actions. And so we recognize both as knowledge evolves, we want that new knowledge to shape our action, but we're also still playing catch up to the many information demands that are made on the science community by those trying to take action. So both sides have shaped it. So how did we do it? First of all, from all of those who have contributed thus far and are on the line today, I'm very grateful for everyone's input. But the next slide on engagement and development sort of shows roughly how we did this. And it was a bit of learning as we went, because we'd not done this before in Canada. So we continued that science policy dialogue we started in 2018 with further engagement. We sent out surveys. We did a request for information process to academic organizations, and MEOPAR responded, thank you, as well as holding provincial territorial discussions, approaching national Indigenous organizations, and really listening to the engagement that was already underway for adaptation and emission reduction planning. In parallel, we held 7 expert science roundtables where we asked those who are expert in the field to help us identify the science activities needed to address the grand science challenges and the information needs of our climate program and climate policy colleagues. These started out spanning the themes of Climate Science 2050 I noted in the beginning. We also held a very small Indigenous academic scholars workshop and included a peer review process because we did want to keep this grounded in scientific excellence. Around all of it, we had a science advisory group that was composed of departmental science advisors. These are people who have cross postings between academe and the federal government and worked for the office of our chief science advisor, Dr. Mona Niemer. And all of this was to culminate in our science and knowledge plan. So the structure of the plan on the next slide, one back, is to start out saying our intent is to follow these guiding principles. We're going to identify the science priorities by the themes, but really, for me, a very fascinating thing happened. Those lovely themes that we developed for Climate Science 2050 2 years ago didn't totally work. Absolutely necessary. We still need to address science gaps with respect to public health, resilient ecosystems, etc. But we kept hearing about very specific science challenges that cut across all of these themes and or cut across all regions of Canada. So we identified a set of research topics called convergence research topics that intersected multiple themes and disciplines, very much transdisciplinary. They were relevant across all regions and sectors, but also had a really complex set of interdependencies, interactions, and feedbacks across the environmental, ecological, socioeconomic, and health systems. And this is where, perhaps the most enjoyable part of the plan emerged, because these turned out to be the topics that our clients for the science were most interested in. So we had very specific discussions and development of science activities and priorities around prediction of extremes, notably extreme events, the carbon cycle, understanding the water climate nexus, Arctic climate change, and also One Health and climate change. So One Health is the intersection of relationships between human health, animal health, and plant health. So it's where vector-borne disease, infectious diseases, zoonotic diseases emerge. There was also a very explicit need to discuss net zero pathway science, as well as linking up our research to that gets us to sustainable development, and then emerging discussions around the whole theme of security. So this is what we have added to our structure, in addition to the theme priorities. And then, of course, we've sustained our conversation around the necessary scientific infrastructure. Next slide, please. So how do you prioritize this when everybody says everything has to happen? It's all important. Well, with a great deal of difficulty. But we did have 8 criteria that shaped this process. We were really looking for opportunities to mobilize knowledge. We already understand this in the science community. How do we get it out and make it useful? We looked at where there was a readiness to encourage that science community with modest investment to get to the next level, the next generation of tools, models, data. We wanted to know if there was a particular opportunity that could be facilitated by national coordination and really nurturing specific research partnerships. We wanted to bring forward the transdisciplinary science, those convergence research topics. We wanted the science very much to focus on multi-scale outputs, because climate action is happening at every scale in every region. Looking at the intersectional lens, but also recognizing where we want to leverage international science leadership and participation. And so what we ended up with was a tiered set of priorities that fundamentally says we need science to advance on all of these fronts in parallel. But if you force us to pick where the money in our budget has to go, we would start with prediction of extremes and motivating action. And so this piece here was seen very much as critical to getting urgent action underway, but also the implementation of all of those plans we've set for ourselves. The second tier reflects the importance of Indigenous climate change science leadership across all areas. And then we move forward with the convergence research priorities, where there's that immediate need to bring forward knowledge, particularly around quantifying emissions that have occurred to date, as well as future emissions pathways. And for adaptation, bringing together the science around One Health, water, and the Arctic. That's not to say that the remaining substantial knowledge gaps for each of the themes are less important. They absolutely have their place and need to proceed, and we have prioritized science activities across all of those themes. Again, underpinning this is a very strong statement around the importance of climate change data platforms and analytics that can be interoperable, accessible, sustained, to really enable all of that research that we've been talking about. So recognizing the importance of this is to get the science funded. We've also put some effort into talking about how the importance of climate change science goes beyond climate change, and all of the climate impacted sectors and issues will benefit from this research. This is on the next slide. So very much things like work in agriculture, the blue economy strategy, understanding disaster financial assistance arrangements, the freshwater action plan, emergency management, biodiversity in particular, all are going to benefit from moving forward the work in these science activities. And we're continuing to map out those related programs, which also includes things like the food policy for Canada, Canada's youth policy, the national housing strategy, that are, all at risk if we don't get the science right, but more importantly, get the science to the doorstep of those people using it. The next piece that we have been looking at as part of moving forward beyond finishing the plan is on the next slide. And that's what can we do in the federal government to help implement all this? We see very much a role in facilitating the ongoing science policy dialogue interface, but also in developing further discussions and options on what it'll take to sustain and build better national coordination amongst and within all the communities that need to work together. So this conversation is underway right now as we finish the plan. And we've also, as noted on the next slide, really tried to think about, what do those national coordination options, what might they look like? And we are just at the beginning now at looking at examples that are underway in other countries, particularly the UK, the US, and Germany, but also reflecting on the value of a lot of the programs and science ENGOs that exist right now, like MEOPAR and ArcticNet. Why have they been so successful, and what can we learn from this in the larger context? So the last slide is to just sort of say, where we're going. We're using all of the discussions to date to guide any funding opportunity that comes across our desks. We've already had the great fortune to have the thinking around climate science 2050 shape the recent Environmental Damages Fund, Climate Action and Awareness Fund, both for net zero science and greenhouse gas mitigation science. We know the NSERC program, the Alliance Mission Grants, has leveraged some of our thinking, as well as this new initiative led by the U.S. National Science Foundation for International Climate and Clean Technology Research with the granting councils. So this is one of the reasons we've been very transparent and happy to share drafts all along the way, is so that people can use it. The planning is underway. It's not going to stop and wait for us to finish proofreading the plan. And I'm quite happy to see groups like MEOPAR already leveraging it. We do hope to have it all released later this winter, and ask you as a community, along with all others, to see where there are opportunities to implement the science priorities we've identified. And of course, we would continue to really flag those opportunities for knowledge mobilization, science assessment, to bring it to the forefront and into the size, shape, and format that those who need to use the science can work with. So I think, Doug, I'll stop there and let you guide the rest of the panel.
Thanks so much, Marjorie. I say, kind of visionary, kind of massive in scale, but exciting. And yeah, it's very, very interesting to see the scale and the breadth of what's envisioned for tackling.
Well, it was a little bit brave, perhaps. When we looked at what had happened in other countries, we found very few, if any, examples where people acknowledged that a lot of the science we do is common to informing both mitigation and adaptation responses. And I mean, there weren't enough of us to do 2 science plans either. So why not try and do something in a much more integrated way?
Yeah, no, and that's true in Canada. We've got to pool our resources and pool our viewpoints and tackle things. So that's so I think probably what we should do, if it's okay, I think we maybe can go on to Keith's presentation, which I think is going to focus on the ocean aspects of the climate science 2050 plan, and then we'll have opportunity, I expect, to have questions from the everybody who's online at the moment. So Keith, if it's okay, if you're ready, if you can go ahead. And
sure,
thanks for joining us, by the way.
Can you hear me okay, Doug?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, sounds good. So thank you very much, folks, for inviting me to this session today. Just introduce myself quickly to those who may not know me. My name is Keith Lennon. I'm the Director of the Ocean and Climate Change Science Program at Fisheries and Oceans under the science sector. I also want to recognize the fact that we've had the opportunity to work with MEOPAR and on a number of different other activities of particular interest and the particular pride from my perspective is the advancement of the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observation System. And that has demonstrated to me, not just that, but that specifically has demonstrated to me the value that an organization such as MEOPAR can bring to the advancement of such a drastically like a large visionary project such as this. So very much appreciate the opportunity to speak. And I want to reiterate the fact that obviously as we move forward, MEOPAR, other networks around the country in the ocean sciences domain, academic institutions and others will have a significant role to play if we are to make some progress associated with this CS2050. So I've been asked to come here today to sort of talk a little bit about the CS2050 from the perspective of the oceans domain. Obviously, you guys know your work probably better than I do. But what I would like to do is sort of see if we can take a look at it from a perspective of what we're seeing and sort of look at the ways by which we can sort of consume the elephant seal bite by bite, and how we could perhaps look at the CS2050 from an ocean science domain and identify areas where we can work as a community to make some significant advancements and move beyond a plan into specific action. So next slide, please. So just, obviously there's a fair bit of background that goes into this, and you guys are probably much more acquainted with the science than I am. But basically, if you look at recent information that's coming from the IPCC, the Canada's Changing Climate Report, the roundtable work that was done associated with the CS2050, as well as the peer reviews, Canada is already in the throes of climate change, and we're seeing warming in the Canadian waters and the Canadian climate around double the magnitude that we're seeing on the global average. So we're much more vulnerable to climate change in a number of different areas. Significant storms and hurricanes as we have with Fiona, etc. And there's a number of consistent risks that we're facing in the ocean domain. Currently, I guess if you look at it from an impact perspective, you look at it and understand that the oceans are becoming warmer, more acidic, and less oxygenated, which are impacting the ecosystems, the living natural resources, as well as the physics of the oceans themselves. Obviously, ocean warming is leading to increases in the severity and frequency of storms. The changes to our sea ice, not only in the Arctic, but even on the St. Lawrence River and other aspects of a little further south. We're also seeing extreme weather, extreme heat extremes in the coast, as well as changing the abundance of the fisheries themselves, the distribution and shifts of the fisheries themselves towards the poles. And then climate change and the warming of the oceans is also exacerbating and accelerating the deoxygenization of Canadian waters. And the pH of the Canadian waters is changing dramatically, which is making it very difficult for a number of different species to create shells and to thrive. So when you look at it from perspective of the next slide, please. When you look at it from the perspective of, in general, the risks are being felt across Canada. However, there are some variability that are being seen from a basin by basin perspective. And as we go forth with the implementation of the actual CS2050, I think this is an important factor for an organization like MEOPAR to make sure that some of the priority areas on a basin by basin perspective are captured and not necessarily left out of the equation as we move forward for examining the priorities and science areas that are being examined. So for example, on the East Coast, through a number of different activities we've done within Fisheries and Oceans and also working with external groups, there's a number of risks that are, I wouldn't say specific, but more impactful on the East Coast than they are elsewhere. So infrastructure vulnerability is a prime example of that. Sea level change and the impact to low-lying areas, as was seen with Fiona, is very much impacting our ability to maintain and sustain our coastal infrastructure. There's been a significant change in the biological resource abundance, distribution, organization of species themselves. This is actually not just a this is not just a risk, it's actually an opportunity. As some of the risks in the stocks move towards the poles, there's opportunities for the Canadian fisheries sector to take advantage of some of the stocks that are moving up from the states, such as the lobster. And then we're also seeing significant changes on the East Coast associated with ocean chemistry, especially in the areas such as the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where we see significant oxygen depletion and increases in pH. Next slide, please. So if we move over to the other coast, on our left coast of the Pacific Basin, it's a little bit different. Some similarities, but some difference. So the changes, there are significant changes in the biological resources and abundance, species distribution and organization, but we're seeing a lot of that happening as well at the lower trophic level, which is impacting the entire food web. That is obviously happening on the East Coast, but that is one of the larger threats on the West Coast. The changing ocean chemistry is also an area of significant concern on the West Coast. A lot of it has to do with the changing in the upwelling and the physics that are coming on the West Coast from the actual ocean currents, etc. And then the marine heat waves, as we've seen off the West Coast with the blob offshore, and then also recently in the more coastal areas, can have a drastic and sudden impact on the species and ecosystems in the area itself. So that's an area where the marine heat waves is in the extremes is something that we really need to take into consideration. Next slide, please. And then if we look at the Arctic Basin in many cases is much more susceptible to climate change itself, and the impacts are happening at a much higher rate. There are significant changes to the seasonality, duration, and thickness of sea ice, which are impacting everything from hauled areas for marine mammals to changing the timing of algal blooms, which the food web depends on, as well as causing freshwater influxes and changing ocean physics itself. There's also changes in the biological resource abundance, species, ecosystems, organization, distribution. New species are moving into some of the Arctic areas. And also there will be, as you move forward, increased access and navigation in the Arctic, which will then put increased demands on the Arctic ecosystems, putting them at further risk as we move forward. Next slide. So the reason I mention that is I just wanted to make sure that as we go forward with the discussion, the CS2050, you take into consideration all the sort of risks and impacts that are happening to Canadian oceans, but you also take a look at it from perspective of where do we sort of identify our niche where we can make some advancements in the science related to climate change and how it will impact the oceans themselves. So as Marjorie went through, she went through the plan itself and identified the national tiered priorities areas. And then as you would see, if you were to take a look at those priority areas through a lens of just the oceans alone, the ocean sciences community would basically fit into every single one of these priority areas. So how do you take a large elephant or a large elephant seal and then basically start to chomp away at it bit by bit? So when you look at it, even just from the ocean science community, let alone the climate change science community at large, that it is a very, very ambitious and visionary document where we want to make some progress. So if we take a look at it, what I'd like you to do is sort of take a look from your perspective of your conversation as we move forward, looking at the role of MEOPAR, looking at the sort of changes we see from a basin perspective, and then also looking at the priorities. Where can we sort of identify as an ocean science community where we can make some significant progress together? I had the opportunity about 7 years ago to go to Spain, and when I was there, I met with the Canadian lead for CFI, and he indicated at the meeting that he said, if I talk to the physics community in Canada about their priorities, they'd identify about 5 different priorities consistent across the whole community. If I talk to 100 people in the ocean sciences community, they'd identify about 200 priorities moving forward. So one thing I find very beneficial about working with an organization such as MEOPAR is they're very good at working with the community at large to bring together the community and to help sort of solidify areas that can make significant progress in priority areas of common concern, or areas that we can actually make progress in conjunction with the federal and provincial and other government agencies. So the CS2050 will provide an opportunity to obviously identify common priority areas, but also work on convergent research areas that not only cross the ocean domain, but other areas as well. Some of those areas could even be some from a data management perspective as well. And also help us better align our community so that as we move forward to seek resources to address emerging areas of climate change science, that we can do it in a fashion that basically allows for us to communicate our sort of consistent vision moving forward, and then also be able to do it in a manner that we don't necessarily step on toes, but we make some concrete actions in specific areas to demonstrate the value moving forward. Next slide, please. So this is where the real sort of bread and butter of what I wanted to present today was. And so the first part was more contextual, just a bit of a conversation about, what we're seeing, sort of what we're seeing with regards to looking through the ocean lens at the science plan itself. But from a DFO perspective and dealing with folks such as MEOPAR and others, I kind of look at it and go, okay, where are the strengths and weaknesses from a DFO perspective? Don't try to laugh when I said strengths there as well. But look at the fact that, there's strengths and weaknesses, but there's also areas that we know that the government itself isn't necessarily as nimble as we need to be to address the evolving needs of climate change. There's obviously processes to go through, et cetera. So how do we work with the community at large, and how do we make more of a significant impact together, similar to what we've done on the CU's perspective on working together on addressing the data management for ocean observation, and to develop a strategy that'll basically involve the ocean science community in general to address some key pillar areas of concern that we're seeing. So some of the areas that I've sort of identified here for your consideration is sort of are based on sort of 4 priority areas that we think that we can actually work with the MEOPAR and others in the academic and external science community to advance, because the capacity may or may not be as present in the government, or there are a lot of opportunities to make some significant advancements because it's an area of increasing and evolving needs. So the first one is nature-based solutions and ocean carbon research. There's a significant, as we move towards net zero, there's a significant role that we think that the oceans can play in mitigating ocean carbon and allowing us to move towards net zero. And we feel that there's a lot of work that has to be done at this point in time with regards to better understanding the ocean carbon processes, transport, as well as functions, as well as better understanding how we can actually attribute and calculate and map the ocean carbon sequestration and emissions in a Canadian perspective. There's not a lot of work that's currently happening within the federal government in this domain, and this is an area that we need to make some significant progress as we move forward in the near future. Another area with regards to ocean carbon itself is sort of the role of the blue carbon and how we actually look at articulating the processes, but not even just the processes, but the amounts of carbon that's being taken up by the blue carbon, and being able to map and understand where that stuff, the storage, is actually taking place in the coastal areas. And then we also need to do some additional work and opportunities to look at nature-based solutions in climate change mitigation and adaptation, including the use of stuff like marine protected areas and how they actually work from an adaptation perspective in protecting coastlines and other aspects of the important fisheries, as well as how those marine protected areas and other areas of reclaimed or restored ecosystems can be used to sequester carbon, etc. So a lot of science and a lot of work is been identified here as being of need to fill. And then another area, if you're moving a little to the right, is the filling the critical gaps with regards to monitoring in understudied areas or with new phenomena. So as you're aware, I mean, if you the Arctic, for example, in Canada is is very understudied from a climate change perspective, at least from the federal government's perspective. A lot of the work that we're doing currently within fisheries and ocean is opportunistic. It's not as regular as we would like it to be. And there's a number of reasons for that, including the cost, etc. So some areas such as that, the coastal areas as well, where much of the economic activity is happening, is not as well monitored or understood as we probably would like it to be, especially when you're looking at emerging trends associated with climate change, such as ocean acidification, deoxygenation, carbon, etc., as well as freshwater. So by working with the ocean science community at large, leveraging capacity, expertise, etc., I think that, you know, through the Science 2050, we could make significant progress in addressing some of the gaps in the science in some of these critical monitoring and knowledge gaps for these understudied areas. The next area that I put for you for consideration and discussion is working with some of the roles of some of the areas of identifying and understanding the vulnerabilities and the impacts. So the risks and the vulnerabilities of different ecosystems, habitats, species, and coastal infrastructure that we're seeing. And not just the ecosystems themselves, but also some of the applicability and the indicators and thresholds that are used during the development of the vulnerabilities, and how that could be applicable to decision-making processes, such as into methodologies for identification of marine protected areas or marine spatial planning. So a significant amount of research has been done and is continuing to be done with regards to risk and vulnerabilities. But considering the complexity and the number of species and ecosystem components and dynamics, there's a significant amount of work that can be done in this regard, but then also looking at how we can actually look at the vulnerabilities and impacts on a more ecosystem-based approach, and how that can be taken into consideration for applicability for decision-making within different bodies themselves. The last area, which is obviously one part of the bread and butter, the MEOPAR perspective, is assisting with some of the work and some of the opportunities for predicting and projecting the future states of the oceans, including extremes. There's a significant body of work that's been done under the previous versions of MEOPAR with regards to modeling itself, but I think that there's a significant amount of effort that needs to be done in an ocean sciences domain to better improve our predictive capacity and our targeted modeling efforts. Also, we need to look at how we actually have higher resolution modeling with larger coverage that will allow us to look at everything from seasonal to decadal to longer term modeling for climate change issues in the oceans themselves, as well as opportunities to advance our knowledge and our capacity for biogeochemical modeling, as we understand, as we know that many of the species that we're trying to manage are directly impacted and change their behavior based on biogeochemical conditions. So those are sort of four thematic areas that I thought that as we brought forward, it might be something that as you go forward, might be something for you guys to consider about from a MEOPAR perspective. How could you actually advance some thematic areas in addressing that hierarchy of needs? But then there's also the other areas which I think are a little bit more foundational or horizontal in nature, that MEOPAR has a very significant capacity and important role to play in advancing for the CS 2050. The first one is knowledge synthesis and mobilization. How do we move beyond data and create information that is basically provided to folks so that people can ingest it and make decisions in a practical manner? How do we actually take some of the work that's been done through the research community in the academic institutions and take that and synthesize that with some of the work that's been done elsewhere and come up with constructive conclusions that can be used elsewhere and in a manner that can be easily used? Also, the partnerships and collaborations component of the role of MEOPAR and like-minded networks. That for me is something that has been extremely beneficial when I worked with CEUS, is to work with Doug and others with regards to working with the academic community. And to be quite frank with you and 100% honest, working with someone like MEOPAR in this regard, and having MEOPAR working with their other academic institutions and other networks has provided a significant amount of credibility to different issues. Instead of the government coming and saying this is what we think you should do or how you should do it, it's also the credibility that comes with an organization such as MEOPAR, and it makes a significant improvement into the building of trust. And I would think that in my mind, that is one of the areas I think that is very, very important for you guys to think about as you move forward. And obviously the infrastructure optimization, sharing of platforms, both real and virtual, be it with monitoring platforms or stuff like CUS, etc., for sharing of the information is very, very important. And MEOPAR and organizations such as yourselves provide a significant role in making sure that we have a better optimization of those platforms themselves. And I believe that's it for the presentation. But basically, again, what I wanted to do is sort of say, here's some of the risks we're facing. They're obviously different depending which region you're in, but they're from their severity and their type of risks. But here are some areas where perhaps we could make some significant progress I'm looking at it from a DFO perspective on where we need some help from the academic community in general. And then where I've seen through experience of working with folks in MEOPAR, just the strengths that you guys will bring to the table. So that's it. And I'm more than willing to answer any questions. I apologize